Welcome to the creepiest British pubs, where pints are served with a heavy dose of the paranormal. These aren't just local taverns, they are cursed grounds where the dead refuse to leave. Let's step into the dark. Location number 1. Ye Olde Trip to Jerusalem, Nottingham. Carved directly into the unforgiving, soft sandstone cliff deep beneath the imposing shadow of Nottingham Castle, Ye Olde Trip to Jerusalem is widely considered the oldest functioning public house in England. But this 12th century cavern is not merely a historic novelty. It is a deeply cursed, suffocating tomb, violently infected by an institutional legacy of slow starvation, dark magic, and medieval executions. The terrifying blood curse of this establishment is physically anchored in the shadowy rock lounge. Suspended high above the oblivious patrons sits the cursed Galleon, a small, nameless wooden model ship heavily cloaked in decades of toxic grime and ancient cobwebs. Historical National Heritage Archives clearly document a strict, inescapable death omen tied to this innocuous object. The last 3 individuals who dared to casually brush the thick dust off its miniature sails all met sudden, agonizing, and entirely unexpected deaths within exactly 12 months of touching the wood. Terrified by this undeniable triple fatality, the management permanently banned anyone from touching the macabre relic. It was finally sealed away inside a heavy glass box, forever locking the deadly curse inside. However, the most aggressive paranormal activity lurks deep below the floorboards in the subterranean cave cellars. This pitch-black interconnected maze houses a genuine medieval condemned cell. It is a brutal, low-ceiling dungeon where helpless prisoners were ruthlessly chained to the damp stone walls, completely starved in absolute darkness, and mercilessly tortured until their organs failed while waiting for the gallows. Today, modern visitors and staff who bravely step into this black vault frequently encounter a highly aggressive, violent poltergeist force. Victims report an invisible, suffocating weight that violently compresses their chests, desperately cutting off their air supply in the dark. These terrifying physical attacks are always accompanied by sudden, sickening temperature drops, well below freezing. Finally, a localized, revolting scent of raw iron and rotting human flesh permanently stains the stagnant air, forcing terrified customers to flee the underground premises in an absolute screaming panic, vowing to never return to the cursed dark. Location number 2. The Queen's Head, Chislehurst. Tucked away in the quiet, unassuming streets of Greater London, the Queen's Head appears to be a perfectly ordinary, welcoming British pub. But behind its charming facade lies a chilling tale of bitter rejection, tragic death, and a relentless, lingering resentment that violently manifests in the physical world. This historic establishment is strictly governed by a deeply unsettling, cursed energy, proving that some grudges simply refuse to die, even long after the physical body has completely rotted away in the cold water. The terrifying paranormal activity inside this pub is notoriously aggressive and dangerously unpredictable. Staff members and terrified patrons frequently report everyday items mysteriously moving completely on their own. But the unseen entity does not just move things, it throws them with vicious intent. Heavy glass pints and ceramic cups are routinely hurled off the wooden shelves by an invisible, forceful hand, shattering violently against the floorboards. The atmosphere can shift instantly from warm and inviting to suffocatingly cold and deeply threatening. Local historians and paranormal investigators trace this chaotic, poltergeist-like violence back to a highly specific and tragic event. Decades ago, a loyal, regular customer, a local punter who spent his days drinking at the heavy wooden bar,
fell on desperately hard times. When a strict new landlord took over the establishment, he ruthlessly refused to put the desperate man's drinks on a tab, publicly humiliating him and casting him out into the freezing, unforgiving night. The heartbroken and desperate man never recovered from this shame. Just hours later, his lifeless, waterlogged body was discovered floating face down in a murky, freezing pond nearby. The authorities officially ruled his sudden death as a tragic drowning, but the dark curse of the Queen's head suggests otherwise. His deeply offended, restless spirit immediately returned to the exact establishment that cruelly rejected him in his final hours. Today, he remains permanently trapped within these walls, furiously throwing glasses and violently destroying the pub's inventory in a never-ending, macabre temper tantrum. It is a chilling, terrifying reminder that in the creepiest British pubs, a denied drink can easily summon an eternal, violent haunting.
Location number 3. The Starving Rascal, Stourbridge. There is a deeply unsettling rule in the world of the supernatural. If you name a building after a horrific tragedy, you are openly inviting the dead to stay. The Starving Rascal in Stourbridge is a prime, terrifying example of a cursed establishment that proudly wears its macabre history like a badge of honor. But the restless spirit that aggressively haunts this creepy, historic pub is not a friendly, lingering local. It is a starving, desperate entity, consumed by absolute misery and revenge. The dark legend of this pub revolves around a tragic, impoverished tramp who begged for a simple meal on a freezing winter night. Cruelly refused any food or warmth by the heartless owners, the desperate man simply curled up on the cold front steps and slowly, agonizingly, froze to death. The pub was later grimly renamed in his honor, but this morbid tribute did not grant his soul any peace. Instead, it permanently anchored his sorrowful, angry phantom to the exact physical location of his cruel demise. Today, the paranormal activity at the Starving Rascal completely shatters the barrier between the living and the dead. The haunting is incredibly physical. Eerie, wet, bare footprints mysteriously manifest across the wooden floors, footprints that stubbornly refuse to go away, no matter how hard the terrified staff scrubs the floorboards. The landlady herself has reported the sickening, icy sensation of unseen hands physically grabbing her in completely empty rooms. Heavy glass pints loudly swing from their racks for absolutely no logical reason. The manifestations regularly escalate from creepy to genuinely dangerous. Astonished patrons have watched in absolute horror as a spectral, disembodied hand reaches out from the void to slowly pick up a freshly poured pint of beer before completely vanishing into thin air. In one of the most violent poltergeist outbursts ever recorded at the property, a heavy television set was forcefully hurled off a high shelf, violently smashing onto the floor. The Starving Rascal is still here, and he is fiercely demanding the service he was fatally denied.
Location number 4.
The Falcon, Bletsoe. Nestled deep in the rural Bedfordshire countryside, the Falcon appears to be a picturesque, historic coaching inn. However, beneath its charming traditional exterior lies a violently active paranormal hotspot, completely saturated with the restless, chaotic energy of the creepiest specters in Britain. This is not a passive haunting. It is a cursed, interactive nightmare where the unseen dead openly refuse to remain silent, aggressively making their terrifying presence known to anyone brave enough to step inside. The chilling poltergeist activity here completely defies all logic. Heavy, deliberate footsteps loudly echo across the wooden floorboards in a completely empty room located directly above the main bar. The physical manifestations are breathtakingly violent. In one horrifying incident,
Massive, heavy wooden bookcases completely detached from the solid walls and literally floated through the air before crashing down. Everyday objects are relentlessly moved, violently thrown across the room, and forcefully shoved off shelves by unseen hands, leaving the terrified staff in a constant state of agonizing suspense. The auditory hauntings are equally disturbing. The suffocating silence of the pub is frequently shattered by the sickening sound of disembodied, frantic whispering in empty corridors, and the blood-curdling, echoing cries of a screaming, invisible baby. Most alarmingly, one terrified waitress was completely paralyzed with fear when she distinctly heard her own name being clearly whispered directly into her ear by a phantom voice, proving that the entities here are deeply, frighteningly aware of the living. The primary source of this terrifying chaos is believed to be the tragic spirit of a young Ostler who cared for the horses during the bloody Jacobite Rising of 1745. He was tragically found dead in the hayloft after suffering a fatal plunging fall. Today, his restless ghost fiercely claims the gardens and the pub as his eternal domain. He heavily favors the cold kitchen area, where he is blamed for hiding crucial items and plunging the staff into absolute paranoid madness. The Falcon is truly cursed, an inescapable prison for a boy broken by gravity.
Location number 5. The Phantom Coach, Coventry. Located on the Fletchamstead Highway in Coventry, the Phantom Coach openly advertises its terrifying paranormal legacy right on its hanging wooden sign. But the macabre name of this cursed establishment is not just a clever marketing gimmick. It is a grim, permanent memorial to a horrific, unsolved tragedy that swallowed an entire carriage of doomed souls. This pub is not merely haunted by a single ghost. It is eternally tormented by a violent, repeating echo of absolute terror. According to chilling local legends, this modern pub stands directly over the ancient ruins of an isolated, historic coaching inn. Over 2 centuries ago, a heavy, horse-drawn passenger coach, desperately racing through the pitch-black night, utterly failed to arrive at its destination. When a frantic search party scoured the desolate area the following morning, they discovered a set of deep, violent carriage tracks, plunging directly into the treacherous, suffocating mud of the local marshes. But of the heavy wooden coach, the terrified passengers, and the frantic horses, there was absolutely no sign. They were completely swallowed alive by the earth. Today, the cursed road outside the pub is violently haunted by the spectral reenactment of that fatal midnight ride. A phantom coach is frequently observed, or terrifyingly heard, tearing down the road at breakneck speed. The deafening, phantom sounds of heavy hooves, a cracking whip, and the blood-curdling, frantic screams of the doomed passengers violently shatter the quiet night. Inside the pub itself, the haunting becomes deeply personal and aggressively physical. The doomed coachman, known locally as Charlie, permanently haunts the cursed building. Long after the doors are locked and the living have gone home, the terrifying sounds of violent banging and unexplainable heavy thudding echo from the empty rooms. The poltergeist activity here is relentless. Heavy, pressurized beer barrels are maliciously disconnected by unseen hands in the dark cellar. Glass bottles are violently rattled on the shelves, and essential items are constantly hidden, proving that Charlie is still desperately, angrily trying to complete a journey that ended in the cold, suffocating mud centuries ago. Location number 6. The Red Lion, Rastrick.
Hidden deep in the heart of West Yorkshire, the Red Lion in Rastrick is a grim, suffocating monument to despair and sudden, violent poltergeist activity. While many haunted and creepiest British pubs boast romantic legends of ancient soldiers or wandering monks, the terrifying paranormal presence here is rooted in a highly documented, deeply disturbing tragedy from the 20th century. It is a cursed property where the absolute darkest corners of the human mind have left a permanent, violent stain on the physical environment. The epicenter of this absolute nightmare is the cold, dimly lit bottle store. In 1910, the heavy burden of running the establishment completely shattered the mind of a former landlord. Overwhelmed by an inescapable, suffocating darkness, he tragically took his own life, hanging himself from the heavy wooden beams inside that very storage room. His horrific death instantly cursed the property, permanently anchoring his violently distressed spirit to the exact location of his agonizing final breath. For decades, the paranormal manifestations at the Red Lion have been terrifyingly aggressive, proving that the trapped entity is consumed by blind, destructive rage. Patrons and terrified staff members have frequently witnessed heavy glass pints and framed pictures being violently hurled to the ground by an unseen, forceful hand, shattering into countless pieces. The oppressive, sickening energy in the building is so potent that even animals are deeply affected by the lingering, macabre curse. During the 1980s, a resident pet dog would aggressively bark, bare its teeth, and violently refuse to enter the shadowy bottle store, instinctively sensing the invisible horror lurking just beyond the threshold. While modern management quietly hopes the entity has finally moved on, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere remains. Stepping into the shadowy corners of the Red Lion feels exactly like stepping into a cold, invisible noose. It is a terrifying, permanent reminder that suicide does not always end the agonizing suffering. Sometimes, it merely traps the tortured soul inside a terrifying, never-ending loop of violent poltergeist rage within the very walls they died in.
Location number 7. The Shakespeare, Manchester. Standing prominently on Fountain Street, in the bustling heart of Manchester, the Shakespeare is a bizarre, architectural Frankenstein's monster with a deeply cursed, violent past. Originally constructed in Chester, this massive, historic, timber-framed building was carefully dismantled and physically transported to Manchester in 1926. But they did not just bring the ancient wooden beams and heavy stone bricks. They unknowingly transported a horrific, blood-stained legacy and a pair of permanently trapped, warring spirits. The macabre, violent history of the Shakespeare revolves around a brutal, horrific crime that permanently poisoned the atmosphere of the building. According to dark local legends, a deeply sinister, violent chef ruthlessly attacked a young, innocent Victorian kitchen girl in the bowels of the establishment. In a desperate, frantic attempt to escape his terrifying assault, the girl accidentally knocked over a candelabra, violently setting her own clothes alight. She burned to death in absolute, excruciating agony. Overwhelmed by a suffocating wave of guilt and absolute terror, the monstrous chef immediately retreated to the upper floors and cowardly hanged himself by the neck. Today, this creepiest British pub is intensely haunted by both the victim and her monstrous attacker, forever locked in a cursed, spiritual proximity. The young, tragic girl is frequently witnessed aimlessly wandering the lower floors and the cold kitchen area. Despite her horrific, agonizing demise, she is known to be a relatively friendly, sorrowful apparition. Her ghostly presence is strongly tied to a heavy, antique rocking chair in the kitchen, which frequently begins to rock violently back and forth on its own, completely untouched by human hands. However, the upper floors of the pub are strictly governed by a deeply oppressive, malevolent energy. The dark, looming phantom of the murderous chef is frequently seen lurking in the shadowy corridors above, casting a heavy, suffocating dread over anyone who dares to cross his path. The Shakespeare is not just a cursed historic pub. It is a permanent, terrifying crime scene where the dead are brutally forced to share the same haunted roof for all of eternity. Location number 8. The George, Hitchin. Nestled in the historic market town of Hitchin, Hertfordshire, the George is a heavily cursed, centuries-old coaching inn that harbours the restless, mischievous spirit of a brutally murdered teenager. While some haunted pubs are plagued by demonic entities or suffocating malevolent forces, the paranormal activity inside this creepiest British establishment is highly intelligent, remarkably physical, and completely obsessed with causing relentless, chaotic mischief for the living residents. The tragic, blood-soaked history of this pub centres entirely around a horrific, unsolved crime from the distant past. Deep within the cold, shadowy confines of the pub's original stables, a young 19-year-old boy was viciously ambushed and brutally stabbed to death in a frantic, bloody altercation. His cold, lifeless body was left to bleed out in the dirt, entirely stripped of his future and his dignity. But the violent, agonizing trauma of his sudden murder refused to let his young soul gracefully cross over. Today, the restless, unseen phantom of this murdered teenager, affectionately yet nervously nicknamed George by the terrified staff, permanently haunts the historic property. The poltergeist activity here is not merely a residual echo, it is highly deliberate and frustratingly interactive. The deafening, unmistakable sounds of heavy, disembodied footsteps are frequently heard loudly pacing up and down the entirely empty, creaking wooden corridors in the absolute dead of night. But George's terrifying, unseen presence goes far beyond simple phantom noises. The ghost is notorious for physically manipulating the environment to cause maximum confusion and absolute chaos. Heavy, solidly locked bedroom doors are mysteriously unlatched and thrown wide open by invisible hands. In one highly documented, deeply unsettling recurring phenomenon, George is directly blamed for intentionally letting the terrified resident cats out of securely locked rooms, proving that physical barriers are completely useless against this cursed entity. The George stands today as a chilling, inescapable reminder that a violent, sudden death does not always create a weeping, sorrowful ghost. Sometimes, a brutal murder simply traps a chaotic, restless teenager in the shadows, doomed to relentlessly torment the living from beyond the bloody grave. The pints may be cold, but the unseen hands that pour them are much colder. To uncover more of history's darkest curses, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching History Legends Docs.